Sister Q.
And I am your co-host, Nomsa, known as Nomsa.
Known as Namsa. Today, we are joined by our head elder of the church, Elder Adolf. We welcome you, Elder Adolf, and we are so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me as well.
Yeah. So today we have a bit of a heavy topic, but I think these topics are very important for us to talk about as a church. And I think when we don't have these conversations, it sometimes does more harm than good. So today we are actually going to be talking about child molestation and the duty that the church has when it comes to these topics and child abuse. And I just want to read a verse for us, Matthew 18, verse 6, that says, "But whosoever shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." So this is a very heavy verse. It's a very scary verse. But I think I wanted to show that God doesn't take lightly when it comes to his children. God doesn't take lightly when it comes to his babies. And it is our duty to take care of these little ones. So Namsa's just going to start us off. She's going to kickstart us with the podcast.
All right. How have historical patterns of cover-ups within religious institutions impacted the current landscape of child protection?
I think the best way to answer this question is if you look at society, right, even in a church setup as it were, you would find that there are certain things that we generally tend to get used to. And once we get used to them, the more we often practice them or do them, it becomes a culture of that society or a culture of that particular church. So it's the same thing with this issue of child molestation. As serious as it is, that the more it happens in a church setup and we tend to keep quiet in the name of Christianity and in the name of wanting to minister to the perpetrators, the more the sin becomes quite a recurring event in a church setup. And that is something that we do not want. And I think that's what has been happening over the years, if you were to look at it, that because it has been happening a lot quite lately, and maybe even over the years, and we haven't been doing much about it as a church, so it has become so ingrained within us that it has become a problematic system in the church that we don't even know how to deal with it if it happens. So at the end of the day, if we then tend to keep quiet about it, it therefore means that we risk making our churches or the religious landscape in general a breeding ground for such behaviors. And when that happens, it means that we're going to lose our purpose. And when we lose our purpose, it means that we're going to lose our values, and then we're going to lose what we are called here to do. So that's how this issue has actually impacted the church environment as it were.
I think also it's something that happens under wraps. Like I don't think I hear much about it, but when you hear about it, it's one of those things where when one thing comes out, then it opens up a can of beans, and then it's similar to the whole when either like if a pastor cheats on his wife, and then on social media now it starts buzzing. This pastor also cheated on his wife, and that pastor, and that pastor, and that pastor. So I think it's one of those things that is very quiet and very under wraps, and no one is speaking about it or isn't coming to light. But the sad reality is that it is happening, and that then means that children are suffering in silence.
It's true, it is happening, and quite a lot, and it has always been happening, by the way, unfortunately. And it happens, unfortunately, at the risk of the children, right? Of course, we may want to minister to everyone else in church, including the perpetrators, but the question is, so what then do we do about the children who are being affected, who are being molested in such a way? So at the end of the day, I think that's what then puts us in a tight corner, as it were, as a church, because we don't know how to deal with such issues. We only know how to deal with spiritual issues, but when it comes to such issues, we don't know how to deal with them, which is the big problem, I think, as well, that we find in a church setup.
And I think definitely like we as a church have to be, we have to, our Christianity must be, I want to use the word practical, but it must also, oh yes, it must also address social issues. So it mustn't be silent to the social ills that are happening around us, because that, like Jesus addressed the social issues. Jesus addressed these things, and he didn't let things like just go silent. That brings us to our next question, which is quite similar, and I think we touched on this a bit. But why do you think that molestation is such a taboo topic in the church? And how can we break that silence? Like, why do you think why do you think we're very uncomfortable with this?
So, so one of the reasons, um, it's mainly because of the fact that we as Christians, we tend to think that as soon as we walk in the door there, through the door there into the church, right, we are all saints, right? And there's nothing wrong with that thinking, but that's something that could never be far from the truth, right? Because the devil is out there, and as much as he is out there, for all we know is that he also uses people, right? So as much as saints walk through the church doors to worship God, we also have people that are led by the spirit of the devil, who are here to drive the agenda of Satan. So because we don't think like that as Christians, we only think from the perspective of we are here as Christians to worship Jesus, and that's it. That's where the problem is, right? Because as long as we think like that, that's when we risk getting caught unaware when such things happen. And when that happens, we don't even know what to do. And we don't know what to do, we take long to deal with it. When we take long to deal with it, it means that those children who are being affected and molested are going to suffer even much more. So the biggest problem is that we are blind as Christians to the fact that it's not all who are called Christians who are actually Christians in any given setting.
And I think because of that, that results in kids not being able to speak up in time. Because sometimes we wonder, this has been happening for years. How come this child never said anything? It's also because of not being aware that they actually being abused at that age. Sometimes you don't know this is abuse, and when someone eventually speaks up, a lot of kids that speaking up, they're like, oh wait, this is actually not supposed to be happening to me.
No, that's very true. Um, and and the fact that we have not had systems, as it were, within the church that deal with such matters, you'd find that when they begin to pop up or reports begin to come out, right, and then when a child then realizes that, no man, this thing has also happened to me, so therefore it must have been wrong, right, a long time has already passed on between the event and the time of the reporting, such that we appear as though we are not even doing anything as a church. That's the other side of it as well, because we don't even know how to deal with it, like I mentioned earlier on, and we still need to find ways of dealing with it. We still need to get understanding of what do we do from here, and the like and the like. So at the end of the day, I think it's very, very important for us to take heed of Christ's words, because when he said that be as smart as snakes, or shrewd as snakes rather, right, and as innocent as doves, it actually speaks to this matter, right? That when we come here in church, right, when we hear or when we think that something is happening, we shouldn't just cast a blind eye to it. We should have an open eye to think that could something be happening. That's being shrewd as a snake, right? But at the same time, we need to handle it in such a way that we exhibit our Christian values. Now that's being soft as a dove. But we don't do that, unfortunately.
And the sad part is that a lot of these things happen like under covers. It happens under wraps. it's something that often, like you said, only comes out a little later. So I love watching testimonies, right? And through watching testimonies, I've heard so many people, right, who have ended up, like, maybe they went through depression or went through this and that. They'd always say, like, when I was younger, I was molested. And firstly, sometimes if it's not done by a parent, their parents themselves may not even know or may not even pick up, right? Number one. Number two, the child, because the child is innocent and they're learning and they're depending on the people around them, they don't even know that it's wrong. There's something in them that felt uncomfortable, something that made them feel like this. They didn't feel safe, they didn't feel happy doing that or being touched in that way or whatever, but they didn't know, like, that it was like how bad it was. And only later did they realize that, oh, actually I was actually being abused. And it's sad because it's difficult, I think, for us to identify, even just this first step of identifying that this is happening. I think that's a problem. And I wanted to say that I think what we struggle with, or why it's a taboo, is because we struggle to detach that saint mentality. Like, and I mean, it's not a bad thing, like, in the sense, it's not a bad thing to see people as saints, or rather to see the best in people, you know. Like, it would be unfortunate if I saw you, my elder, and you were presenting the Sabbath school lesson, and I'm sitting there thinking, like, oh, he's so fake, you know, he's all of that. So obviously when I see someone presenting, see someone preaching, my assumption is, oh, this person is genuine. Like, I don't automatically think like they're lying or whatever. But I think then when then we develop that image of, like, oh, this person, he preaches so well, da da da. Because when you see these things come out, the first thing they'll be like, really, but he preached so well, and his revelation studies are so powerful. Like, how could he do something like that? So I think that's also the problem, that it's difficult for us to, when we have a mental image of someone, then to see them, or to see the other things, or the sins that they are doing. And that's why we then sometimes choose to believe the perpetrator over the victim.
That's true. And then just to add something as well, so any given church setup is an extension of a community, right? So, like here at Mowbray, we're predominantly black church, right? So, which means that our community is predominantly black. So, you'd find that in our black communities, such kind of awarenesses, they don't exist, right? Amongst our societies. So when we then come into church, we just basically assume where we are coming from. So it's just an extension, right? So when then something then happens, the way we deal with it in our society then tends to derive or to define how we deal with such matters even in the church. So if we don't deal with them effectively in the society, we protect family members at the expense of the children. So it means that we might as well just do the same in the church. We protect the members at the expense of the children, which is something that is not ideal at all at the end of the day, unfortunately.
Moving on to the next question. How effectively are churches providing support and resources for survivors of abuse, and what more can be done?
That's a very good question. As to the effectiveness of the support that is being provided, I don't think it's something that we can actually adequately answer at this stage where we are. Like we mentioned earlier on, that we are still somewhat finding our feet in regards to how to deal with these matters. But for all we know, is that our church has the abuse prevention office department, both at the conference level and at the church level, the local church level. And the fact that this department exists, right, at the church level and at the conference level, it means that something is being done. We are not just sitting idle and excusing ourselves that we are Christians, as it were. It means that we have come to recognize and to understand that in as much as we are Christians, but sin also actually exists amongst us. So there are measures, there are preventative measures that are put in place to make sure that it doesn't happen. And there are things that have been put in place to ensure that if it does happen that a child is molested, what do we do from there? So at the end of the day, um, the fact that we have the departments in existence and churches are beginning to get informed about the existence of such a department, it means that we are doing something about it, though we haven't gotten to a stage where I believe where we can assess the results of how effective the existence of the department is in a given church.
I think it just reminds me of how I think the only thing that we struggle with is identifying it, because the department is there, and definitely if anyone is going through abuse, we have an abuse prevention department, and it's led by Sister Yada at Mulberry. And so if ever there's anything happening, you can definitely speak to her and reach out to her. I think it's just the first step of identifying that this is happening, and I think perhaps it's something that I guess is worth praying for, because we'll never know until like God reveals it to us that this child or this person is in trouble. Yeah, and I just really think that it's really sad that like people are suffering in silence. And I know at my home church, I don't know if I don't know if there's something that can be done for everyone, but I know for children's ministries they have like a, I think it's an assessment or training where like people have to be checked, like they check you before you are allowed to work with children, because they need to know that this person is okay and they are safe to work with children, and they won't do anything to our children, because anything can happen. I mean, like there's what's this, children have they have their own children's church or pathfinders or whatever it be, and you have a lot of children, and like it may be difficult to see that, oh, this child is missing, or this child has gone there with this elder and they're alone, and all those little things. So it's important for us to know that the people that we've placed in leadership are people that will take care of the children.
And it's true what you just said. Um, the fact that the system that has been put in place alongside the Abuse Prevention Office Department, um, the mandate is that every given church, for every given church that has members who are responsible for children, whether they be women or men, they are supposed to be cleared by the police. So they have to get a police clearance from the police, so that you can then serve, right? So at the end of the day, the effectiveness part of it then comes to how we as local churches are implementing these measures.
There's a saying that says knowledge is power, and I think that's something we need to work on. Like maybe edit as a module for the pathfinders to make them aware that this type of behaviors is abuse. They shouldn't go through that. That it's not okay.
Not true. So I was actually quite happy this year. We attended the conference training for departmental leaders at the beginning of the year. I think it was in January. At the end of the session, after all the departments have presented, the abuse prevention office department at the conference, the pastor, I think it's Pastor Flotman, can't remember very well, but I think it was him. He then presented, I think it was at least 30-minute long session on abuse prevention in the church, and everything that is there, the resources that are at the conference that are there to assist the churches. So definitely we can safely say that the church has been doing something about it, and at this stage I think we can say that it's been effective enough as far as it brings awareness to people.
And then for our next question, how should churches navigate the difference between our legal obligations to report abuse and the moral obligation to protect its members?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. So the book of Romans tells us that we should abide by the laws of the lands in which we are living in, right? At the same time, the book of Exodus tells us that we ought to abide by the 10 commandments. So as Christians, we are bound by the two sets of laws, right? So as you're living in the community, you abide by the laws of that community, right? At the same time, you still abide by the laws of God, right? Same thing when you come into the church, right? you are still supposed to abide by the laws of the land, even if you are in church, right? So we abide by them anywhere and everywhere we are. So I'll give you an example. Let's say for a motorist who's driving, he's a Christian, he's an elder who just comes from church, he's been on duty. Let's just say a pastor, for instance, to make it quite more effective. He has just baptized members that afternoon. And then on his way home, he was speeding. In a 60-kilometer zone, he was doing 90 kilometers. And then he gets hit by the camera. You will be issued by that ticket, and you will have to settle that ticket, right? So his obligation to abide by the 10 commandments do not negate him from abiding by the laws of the land simply because he was a pastor who was just baptizing in there that very afternoon. So the same thing goes with us as Christians, that the fact that we are Christians, if a person molests a child in church, it means that the laws of the land should take over. Because already that will be a criminal issue and a criminal case. And therefore, the law should take over. So there is those two that have to be kept. We cannot think that because we are Christians, therefore we need to protect each other, not send each other to jail. That's not it. That's not how it's supposed to be. Because it is the Bible that strictly says that we ought to abide by the laws of the land. And if the laws of the land define child molestation as a criminal case, therefore it means that it has to be dealt as a criminal case by the laws of the land.
Okay. I think I once heard something along the lines that actually protecting a perpetrator by not reporting them or not having them face the consequences of their actions is also not protecting them, because in a way the consequences of our actions also help us. So it is the consequences of our actions. If you protect the perpetrator, he may not see or understand how deep what he did was. But if he perhaps is arrested and goes to prison, he'll understand that what he did was very deep. And ultimately, the ultimate goal is salvation, right? So it's also to their benefit that they face those consequences, that hopefully the consequences can also bring that person to repentance, perhaps. Like it can show them that what they did was actually really deep. Because sometimes we may not really fathom it until we actually face those consequences. So by us keeping quiet, we're not actually protecting that person. I think the thing that we might struggle with though is, let's say the person does come to prison. Does go to prison and they come out, right? How do we as the church now respond? Like how do we treat them? I think one thing that people always struggle with is, do they come to church? Are they not allowed to come to church? Do they find another church? Like, do we put restrictions? Obviously, there should be restrictions. Like, he or she, shouldn't work with children or anything like that. But what do we do? Can the person serve in front? Well, I don't think they're allowed to serve in front according to the church manual. How do we navigate that space when we do have a perpetrator? They face the consequences, but how do we now, like, kind of behave around them in a way that they can still find a sense of community, I guess, because their salvation matters also, but at the same time making sure that we are not, like, we're not downplaying what they did, and also them realizing that what they did was wrong and grievous.
That's actually a good question as well. If you look at the way we handle someone who has been censured, for instance, right, or even disfellowshipped, and then they come back to church, the same thing should also happen in this case, right? Because at the end of the day, they are still Christians, right? We do not have the capacity to tell whether or not they have actually repented, but we ought to give them the benefit of the doubt that they have actually repented. That's number one. And then number two, our obligation to pray for them never ceases at any given point in time. It still continues, right? We still continue to pray for them, even if they go to hospital. It is our duty and our mandate as Christians to visit them in prison, right? Not in hospital, in prison. It is our duty and it's our mandate to visit them. Because the people that we are visiting in prisons right now, they've probably committed much more heinous sins than they. Do you get the idea? So at the end of the day, we do not then cease to to minister to them, because what we ought to do, what we need to understand is that we then have to rehabilitate them back into the church setting, just like any other person who has left prison and go back to society. They need to be rehabilitated back into the society. We do the same thing with them as well. So we do not, as a church, have that capacity or that mandate to say to someone who has been in prison, you cannot come to church. That's not what we are here for. We are here to minister. However, going back to the point we mentioned earlier on, that even when we are ministering with them, we need not just blind ourselves to the possibilities of them repeating their actions, because people who have done certain things find it much more easier to repeat them. Right. So we need to be careful. That's the reason why we don't quickly give them responsibilities in church. That's the reason why we don't quickly make them stand here in church, because at the end of the day, we are also trying to minister to the rest of the congregation whilst we are ministering to this person. So what we then do is we assign maybe a member or a family that minister on a one-to-one basis with that person. That's how we then tend to rehabilitate them back into the church society.
A follow-up to that would then be, so okay, the person has come back to church, and the child also attends that church. So what measures are put in place for the child not to experience any traumatic scenes and
Yeah, that's. I've heard that question before, and it kind of puts the church in a catch-22 kind of a situation, because at the same time you don't want a child who's been molested by this person facing this person, right? But at the same time, you do not want as well to treat this person who has possibly repented genuinely, right, as though they were still a criminal. So reaching that balance is difficult. It's something that calls for prayer and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Each case has to be dealt with according to its own merits, in my opinion. We cannot just cast um, 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 a general blanket across the board that this is how we deal with this case, and this is how we deal with this matter. But I would think, in my opinion, that if someone were to molest a child, go to jail, and then come out of jail, it would be best possibly to request them to attend a different church. I think, in my opinion, that would be the best thing, because we are not in heaven, by the way. We are still here. These things have happened. This child still suffers a lot because of what has happened, right? And it's not something that can be quickly rubbed off their memory at the end of the day. And remember, they are children. The way they process things and they handle things are different from us as adults, as it were. So I think that could be one of the best ways to deal with it and to handle it. Obviously, after explaining to the perpetrator that it might be best for you to attend in a different church because of A, B, C, D, so that they also understand. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much, my elder, for joining us today. It was honestly a very insightful conversation. And I know that today our conversation just like scratched the surface. I know there's so much more, and we also had so many more questions to talk about and to discuss, but we have run out of time. We just want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for honoring our invitation. It was very, very lovely to have you.
And thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to share from my own opinion as well. And I hope and pray that we get informed as a church, and that we also get to understand how to handle such matters going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been Sabbath Generation Podcast.